Sounding natural history. To what extent are etymological, material, and metaphorical entanglements between water, sound, and hearing meaningful, alongside evolutionary chronologies and actual physiological mechanisms, in querying the landed and terracentric nature of sound and voice propagation? That mechanical wave transduction takes place within the spiral-shaped cochlea and watery endolymph of the inner ear, also known as the organ of Corti, named after the Latin cochlea for snail shell, and the Greek cochleus for spiral, related to concus for muscle conch, might imply that the very mechanisms of hearing itself, at least in the otological dimension, are materially entangled with the figure of the spiral and water. Evolutionary biologist Lynn Margulis advanced a theory of symbiogenesis in which the human senses evolved from a once freely swimming spiral-shaped bacterium called spirochetae, rather than from mitochondria or chloroplasts. She posited that cilia, tiny hair cells at cells' edges, which enable the mechanosensory functioning of human vision, smell, touch, and hearing, are the result of enfolded and invaginated spirochetae, making them into biochimerical compounds. Further, in that the perception of sound results from an operation of physiological transduction of vibrations into nerve impulses or action potentials, except in instances of hypersonic effect or auditory hallucination, it could be argued that sound, so called, is a biological imaginary. In Elements of Physiology, published between 1834 and 1840, Johannes Müller, mentor to Hermann von Helmholtz and Ernst Haeckel, and who favored fish and marine invertebrata in his research, remarked, quote, "Without the organ of hearing with its vital endowments, there would be no sound, but merely vibrations," end quote. Müller's statement is not strictly true, for far from being peripheral, sound also penetrates deaf worlds through alternative modes of sensing, both analog and bionic. However, Müller's statement retains validity in underwater realms, where, for humans, the conditions of habitation are paradigmatically different to those on land and above water. Indeed, humans, unlike highly adapted marine species with still external cilia, are effectively deaf-mute in underwater contexts, where sound waves propagate 4 times faster than in air, for the reason that human eardrums are too akin in density to that of water, and where vocalizing would require the skilled manipulation of air pressure shifts, bubble noise, and bone conduction. NASA maintains its Extreme Environment Missions Operations Program, one of several Earth-based analog missions, 60 feet under the surface of the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Florida, for the reason that underwater conditions provide the most convincing analog on Earth for spaceflight, which suggests that ocean space is more extraterrestrial than terrestrial. Prosthetic technologies of transduction must serve as substitute ears and eyes, for underwater realms are, according to ethnographer of science Stefan Helmreich, not immediately a soundscape for humans because it does not have the spatiality of a landscape. One might rather think of it as a zone of sonic imminence and intensity, a sound state. These spaces must be transduced into what he calls scientifically, technologically, and epistemologically apprehensible zones, but always as what Philip Steinberg dubs a more than human assemblage. How can the various sounds and inaudible sonorities of natural non-human agents and forms of life be rendered audible or transduced into audibility as voiced biophony in order to become apprehensible to publics not underwater, such that natural agents might themselves articulate conditions of climatological change? Can resounding natural histories of hearing, through attunement to aural nature, create openings for an inaudible auditory culture? To attend as humans to the mechanisms of sound production and reception in marine species themselves, from molecular perceptions to molar perceptions, and hearing always already as a threshold condition, boundaried by heterogeneous points of entry and exit, motivates the enactment or inhabitation of a perspective, a habitus that is generatively hard of hearing. Drawing upon this perspective, this paper will attempt to frame Jana Winderen's sonic output in terms of the complex modularity of listening and attunement elicited through her practice of underwater sound recording over time, gathering a variety of hearing knowledges around itself as an alternative metrics for sounding usually unsounded dimensions of paradigmatic environmental shifts, and for theorizing the in unheard, unexplored, unsound, and underwater. I am particularly interested in the conjunction that Stefan Helmreich and his co-author Michelle Friedner make between the disciplines of sound studies and deaf studies. I propose a further connection to ocean studies, especially in relation to ongoing accelerated changes to the sonic environment undersea, caused by acidification, which might be read against a discourse of disability studies and impairment in terms of the variety of detrimental effects on marine species' auditory apparatuses. Janne Winderen is a Norwegian artist whose practice and sonic output intertwines artistic, aesthetic, and scientific engagement, bridging many genres of water that include the oceanic, sea, ice, coastal regions, rivers, and lakes. For the ways in which her work proposes to experiment with technologies to sound ecological health, in the original definitional sense of to measure or to fathom, through mechanisms of resonance production, her work would seem emblematic of Helmreich's notion of sounding as a method of inquiry across and beyond the contemporary sciences. And in that, per Helmreich, resonance both is and is not sound. Her protocols, methodologies, and above all, sensitivities of species recognition and compositional assemblage coax her subject matter into speaking, so to speak, for itself, and ultimately, I argue, into mattering in an operative Latourian sense, from Ding to Sache. Trained in mathematics, chemistry, biology, and fish ecology at the University of Oslo, intending at the time to become a marine biologist, she then studied fine art at Goldsmiths, where she deliberately diverted her attention away from making objects towards experimenting with sound and compositional processes as physical material. Central to Winderen's work is her interest in understanding the physiological bases of auditory apparatuses in marine species, concerned, as she is, by human-created sound underwater and the influences it has on the life there. Scientific studies have shown that seawater with lower pH absorbs less low-frequency sound, a phenomenon scientist Tatiana Iliina calls the less anticipated consequence of ocean acidification. One study used a global ocean model to predict that the chemical absorption of sound will almost halve in regions with high levels of industrial activity, such as the North Atlantic Ocean, over the course of the 21st century, and could fall by 60% in deep latitudes and high latitudes over the next 3 centuries. This, paired with anthropogenic ocean noise emission, exacerbates a phenomenon that Christopher Clark, director of the Bioacoustics Research Program at Cornell University's Lab of Ornithology, terms acoustic bleaching, wherein marine species can no longer navigate via sound. As a naturalist collects specimens, so Winderen conducts sound research under, above, and around the surface of water by fishing for sound. Her projects are sited in threatened acoustic environments, often taking years to unfold. Interviews emphasize the epistemological value that she attaches to voyages and field trips. She repeatedly visits her geographies for the purposes of diagramming marine inhabitants, local communities, and international scientists in relation to the at stake. To collect sonic data, she makes use of processes of vertical recording, with 3 or 4 hydrophones per session, some reaching up to 90 meters in depth, as well as Peterson ultrasound detectors, in order to achieve sufficiently complex surround sound recordings, which she later time expands when recomposing her material into output mediums, translating it into an audible frequency range for human auditors. Her long-term project, Silencing of the Reefs, an ongoing collaboration with Tissin Bornemisza Art Contemporary and a consortium of institutions, including MIT and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, accrues hydrophonic recordings from more than 12 coral reef environments off Central America and throughout the Pacific. That sound is crucial to the vitality of underwater life forms in general finds concentrated expression in coral reefs, which are the hubs of multi-species noise, and makes Winderen's cited sound research highly pertinent in the face of mass coral bleaching and impaired rates of calcification. Her recordings set out to document species' sound signatures on a per-reef basis before such sources vanish, riffing on scientists' use of sound as a technology of identification of species and populations' movements in the field, as well as for monitoring crucial behavioral responses in laboratory contexts. Interpreted alongside recent scientific studies and ecological reports, Winderen's work becomes, broadly speaking, evidentiary as oral testimony of the planetary scale phenomenon of ocean acidification in terms of its panoply of effects deleterious to marine life forms' vitality. The full variety of effects remains unknown in spite of proliferating, if largely unaggregated, scientific studies and governmental research initiatives. A study in 2011 was the first to directly link CO2-enriched environments to altered auditory behavior in juvenile clownfish in response to daytime reef noise. Conversely, a study in 2013 used 3D microcomputed tomography to model and analyze the otolith size and density of larval cobia raised in acidified conditions in situ, and found that their hearing range, auditory and vestibular sensitivity increased due to denser otolith formation. This study was the first to model otolith development while still inside the heads of larval fish. Another project, titled Nature and Renaturation, a sensory overview of a history of changing watercourses, deploys sonic data in different ways to interrogate processes of renaturation following multiple dam dismantlements around the River Orne in France's Basse-Normandie region in an effort to improve water quality, uniting social geographers with scientists and artists. For her contribution, Winderin interprets non-human sound production as its key analytic component and as an indicator of health. She subverts a technique from biology wherein freshwater biologists count underwater insects to measure levels of pollution in a river. Underwater insects produce relatively loud sounds by stridulation through vibration emitted by bodily contortion and rubbing. Winderin pushes this by hypothesizing that if she can identify the sounds of insects likely to survive particular pollutants, in contrast to those that are not, then she might listen to and extrapolate upon the health of a river through hydrophones. Her proposition suggests that processes of depollution might be overheard, and consequently that the very health of an ecosystem might be monitored through attunement to transduced soundings of underwater insects. According to Winderin, she would be the first to correlate underwater insect sound production with the ecological health of a river. I would like to advance the notion of mediate auscultation developed by René Laennec in 1816, who was acknowledged as the inventor of the stethoscope and its accompanying technique, in relation to Winderin's hypothesis that technologically assisted hydrophonic listening to underwater insect sound production can be used as a diagnostic mechanism to ascertain or overhear the health of an ecosystem. As Jonathan Stern theorizes in The Audible Past, mediate auscultation acted to redefine the meaning of listening itself in modern medicine, beyond a simply physiological notion of hearing, into a mediated, skilled, and technologized practice and episteme from medical knowledge production. Laennec's monaural or single-eared stethoscope was a descendant of the ear trumpet, extending its principal function to assist listening. Quote, even as it posited the possibility that doctors could become virtuoso listeners, mediate auscultation endowed its practitioners with a functional disability. The unaided ear was not enough. Now, doctors, whose hearing was ostensibly healthy, could augment their auditory abilities. End quote. Stern connects its design to a lineage of other sound reproductive inventions, such as Alexander Graham Bell's ear phonautograph and telephone, and Thomas Edison's phonograph, which, quote, fetishized the cultural status and trappings of hearing loss, end quote, and were admitted by their inventors to have been born out of their proximity to and desire to cure deafness. Laennec's treatise on mediate auscultation, published in 1819, served as an epistemological guide for audial technique, emphasizing the conjunction of two types of knowledges: a comprehensive cognitive knowledge of pathological anatomy and physiology on the one hand, and a socially organized feel for the activity, a habitus, on the other, derived from the practice of sensory perception, combining both the sensory and the empirical. The stethoscope signaled a shift in the semiotics of clinical diagnosis, de-emphasizing patient speech in favor of the doctor as a sensing agent, now that audial diagnosis, in creating an acoustic enclosure, had turned into a veritable form of physiological hermeneutics. Laennec's treatise, which attempted to systematize sounds heard through the stethoscope, instructed that the linguistic content of the patient's speaking voice was no longer as important as the resonant, purely sonic content of various bodily parts in motion, of the internal passages of liquids and gases. In this scenario, speaking patients with mute bodies gave way to speaking patients with sounding bodies. The innovation of the binaural stethoscope, perfected by George Philip Camon in 1852, enabled its listener to compare multiple soundings simultaneously, extending the stethoscopic principle to include the possibility of a rudimentary echolocation. Physician George Carrick went further in evoking the binaural stethoscope as a prosthetic device, writing that, quote, proximal sounds had become effects of relations at a distance, end quote. Interestingly, in sonar too, hydrophonic signals from separate underwater receivers would be converted into stereo through the use of binaural headphones to permit a dimensionally perceptible portrait of ocean space for human auditors, generating not so much a soundscape as a soundidscape. Circa 1680, a microphone initially meant ear trumpet for the hard of hearing. I hazard that the hydrophone, first fabricated in 1901, like the stethoscope and other sound reproductive technologies that substitute for the ear, is essentially an underwater microphone that is hard of hearing and thus proffers an extended listening. An operator like Winderin, who experiments with scenarios of recording, compositional praxis, and ecological auscultation, might offer a hydrophonic habitus for attuning to Steve Goodman's sonic potentials at the interstices of sound, vibration, and the physiologically and cultural inaudible in non-human sound production and reception. For her attentiveness towards the actual mechanisms of non-human sound production and reception in the field, we might, as a potential public, better understand that the acuity of marine species sensory perception, and especially hearing, is at stake due to the entanglements of anthropogenic noise emission and acidification, that hearing itself is problematized by undersea sonic conflict and chemical shifts, that species are increasingly dispossessed of senses and spatially displaced by sound, an echo of Goodman's sub-politics of frequency, where sonic warfare takes place in the sensations and resonance of the texture of vibration. Can the auditory consequences of acidification be read as a form of distributed impairment that either disables or differently enables organisms depending upon adaptation? Can sound studies, deaf studies, and ocean studies be sounded together to further dissociate terracentrism and phonocentrism? Are Winderin's techniques of audition a form of hydrophonographic anticipation, a versioning of Karl Marx's subjunctive figure of the commodity who speaks, which Fred Moten frames as prescient phonographic anticipation? That she insists on understanding the environments, ecosystems, and their human and non-human inhabitant stories in which she works as part of her method for sounding is interesting in relation to the point that hearing, both historically and etymologically in French, has doubled to connote understanding, the source of Derrida's notorious critique of phonocentrism in grammatology. Mladen Delar writes, quote, "The double sense of the French entendre, which means to hear as well as to understand, points to the direct link between the voice as the origin of conceptuality, between vocality and ideality," end quote. Instead, Derrida calls to think of a new situation for speech, of its subordination within a structure in which it will no longer be the archon. Winderin's sonic output, for its emphasis on overhearing, a form of what Brandon LaBelle postulates as sonic agency, rather than speaking over, might proffer such a situation. In his essay, Some Elements of a Sociology of Translation, Domestication of the Scallops and Fishermen of St. Brieuc Bay, sociologist Michel Calon uses an initiative to repopulate scallops in Normandy to reflect on the technologies of intéressement and representation between various actors, scientists, researchers, fishermen, and scallops, in view of the irony that scallops, although the constituency in question, lack articulable agency. Quote, "A few larvae are considered to be the official representatives of an anonymous mass of scallops which silently and elusively lurk on the ocean floor. The three researchers negotiate the intéressement of the scallops through a handful of larvae which represent all the uncountable others that evade captivity. To speak for others is to first silence those in whose name we speak. It is certainly very difficult to silence human beings in a definitive manner, but it is more difficult to speak in the name of entities that do not possess an articulate language," end quote. It would seem that Winderin is less concerned with her prolific amassment of sonic data in itself, mostly of sound produced by underwater inhabitants inaudible to humans in raw form, than with its transduction in post-production into audibility for a variety of publics, in resounding unsound, and thus in making things public, to borrow from Latour again, such that publics form around matters of concern rather than matters of fact. To publish originally meant to make public through speech, and Winderin's output plays at publishing the speech of nominally mute non-human actors. Through her technological mechanisms of transduction, mute natural matter transmutes into things that talk for themselves, possibly extending the notion of hearing beyond audition or audibility into the realm of underwater unsound along the way. That's it.
Thank you very much. Any questions and comments? Yeah.
Thank you. I just had a question about, because at one point you mentioned phonocentrism and terrorcentrism, or terrorcentrism, and I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit, because I was wondering if you were implying that perhaps terrorcentrism is something perhaps to be avoided, basically. I was wondering if that's what you were implying.
I think inevitable to avoid it, but productive perhaps to think about alongside notions of phonocentrism, because I mean, if we take ourselves underwater, then the conditions in which sound and voice propagate are entirely different and impeded, which can be a way to sort of think through speech, but from its other side. In other words, right, so underwater context, not as speech-centric spaces.
Yeah, sorry. Okay. Well, actually, yeah, I wasn't. Yeah, I think that's slightly different to what I was trying to suggest, which was that perhaps you were. I think that perhaps you were implying that when there's too much of a focus on perhaps ecological concerns, perhaps that's something to be avoided. That was actually what I understood, but perhaps. That's not.
Oh no. No. It's just that I'm wary of the distinction between human and non-human, and so I think that the intention is to think about non-human sound production, but in a way that doesn't binarize it. The ecological, I hope, is central to this paper, but I do take the liberty of investigating the connection between, say, ocean studies and, I mean, not in depth, but between ocean studies and deaf studies, and in terms of sound studies.
So it is a kind of expanded notion.
Yes, right. It doesn't seek to locate itself in only one.
Okay, I have a question about the role of technology in this. In your argument, and especially regarding the artwork of Windory and others, and the question could go to John as well. You talk about these prosthetic devices, and microphones would also be sort of a prosthetic device in that sense, right? In McLuhan's sense for us, but sometimes that's a critique you often hear in ecological. Against ecological art in the broader sense that the technology sometimes seems to withdraw from the actual presentation of the works, but it's very much a part of this ecological thought in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the case of Windren, and I do start. Also, I mean, I start by thinking through Helmreich's theorization of underwater sound. It's clear that some, that technological transduction needs to take place so that it doesn't remain only in sort of unsonic or unsound. But the fact that microphones and hydrophones connect to this lineage of sound reproductive technologies is interesting to me in terms of connecting it to, say, disability studies too, and which has its own ecology, and I think deserves to be connected to other discourses more than it tends to be.
Thanks, Emma, for an interesting talk. I wondered how you felt about the comments that composer Francis White had made, and I think echoed by Hildegard Westerkamp, that there's a kind of sonic tourism going on with this work. That there's one thing recording animals in their natural habitat. It's another putting that sonic experience onto a CD and distributing it, or onto an MP3 file and distributing it, which seems to me as some kind of ecological issue there. And then another where perhaps, as Jana Vinderen does, layers these sounds so that they become a more interesting acoustic experience.
Yeah.
And I know Hildegard Westerkamp has done this also with her work, but I don't know what you think of those decisions that go into that sort of sound manipulation rather than leaving whatever these sounds might be. And of course, there's inevitably further distortions depending on what microphone one uses and how.
Right. Any reproductive technology is already in some ways a distortion, but I don't see that as being a reason not to sort of pursue making work like this. And I think that the process and concept of storytelling is central to Jana's work, and she speaks about this in interviews. In other words, she doesn't. She does not hide the fact that she's playing with the material that she records, abstracting it, in certain ways. But that's, I think, for her, part of a way of entering into dialogue with the inhabitants that she spends so much time with. So I think that there's. I'm interested in the aspect of, say, the journey or the expedition in connection to these kinds of practices, anyway. But I think that there is this, in the case of Jana's work, a certain rigor which prevents it from becoming touristic. And that's different in the case of other artists, ecological sound artists, certainly. And I know that I'm only focusing on a very small piece.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.